This session is organized by a group of individuals who are affiliated to universities. We started this discussion series and we've been meeting regularly from around the time that this pandemic hit last year. What we were trying to understand through these discussions was how the pandemic had affected particularly higher education. And we realized that during the pandemic, fault lines in our social and institutional systems, those based on poverty, growing disparities, issues of communal issues and communal violence, institutional weaknesses, all of these things seem to have got we kind of saw them to a greater extent during the pandemic, kind of accentuated what we already had. So as a group, our questions were, what are the implications of these to higher education? And our focus is on facilitating a discussion that broadens perspectives and that provides space for alternative narratives. Focus is always on providing a forum to discuss issues, considering particularly those who are marginalized from socially and also within the education system. What we have addressed so far is that, please, if you don't mind, mute yourselves. Niyantini, can you just look into that? Okay, getting back to this. So higher education, one of the issues that we brought up was that the higher education system is operating in an increasingly authoritarian structure, and this has affected educational institutions as well. They have tended to create corrupt procedures and accentuate already existing problems, hierarchical nature of the universities themselves. And have created a system where the people at the lower levels are subordinate to those at the higher level, even though our institutional systems are guarded from those kinds of issues. We also discussed the fact that there has been a policy to focus on policy that focuses on the rural economy, but again, the way it is discussed is in a fairly instrumental manner in terms of how the, in an instrumental manner in how the rural economy can serve national development, not so much in terms of supporting rural lives and rural economies. And we have also discussed in the same line that universities have somehow had difficulty supporting this rural economy, that we are kind of disengaged from that, all the problems of the rural villages and also maybe even urban marginalized communities. Finally, in terms of government policy in addressing the issues of the pandemic, it seems as if they are not sensitive to the pain of, again, people and even teachers. They do not seem to address the disparities and the economic struggles that ordinary people face. The policies do not seem to address the social and mental health problems that we all know that students are going through, and even teachers to some extent. And they do, and they seem to elicit a certain pervasive fear among teachers, particularly, and administrators. So within this context, one of the issues that we observed is this issue of employability and the fact and the discussion about whether our graduates are unemployable. So to introduce this topic, I invite Niyantini. Thank you, Niyanthini. So I will introduce, first of all, introduce Dr. Anasuya Subasinghe from the University of Visual and Performing Arts. I'm going to keep the introduction that brief so that we have time to talk about other, for them to start their presentation. Thank you. Anasuya.
Hi, thank you, Shamala.
Is your video on?
Yes. Can you see me?
Yes, thank you.
I'll just turn on the video. All right, thank you. So I'm going to go. I'm going to dive straight into it because we have 8 minutes, and it's a huge topic. So and I must say that this is an extension of a talk that I did for Icon Arts Columbia University conference, a take on that. But so I'm gonna, since I'm starting off the session, I'll just briefly introduce the situation in arts education in relation to employability. Right.
Okay.
Okay. So now with each, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. All right. Okay, there's a slight breakup, but yes. Now with each transition of government and subsequent education policy reforms, right, there still remains this perplexity and an absence of a clear idea of what schools and universities are to do with this thing called arts education, right? So increasingly we are asked if arts education is worthwhile, worth the investment, whether it creates human capital that can be aligned towards the job market and in turn towards economic growth. So, and according to the 2019 audit report on arts education and employability, a 25% decrease in advanced level students opting for the arts was expected in by 2018, right? And instead there was a 45% increase in numbers. So, however, this discouragement in light of the reforms that are emerging as a 10-year plan geared for the knowledge economy, which is focused mainly on STEM education with further emphasis on technology, will continue to impact secondary and tertiary students who wish to pursue any discipline within the liberal arts and certainly the community, the society as a whole, right? So as a result of this, the fundamental purpose of education, and especially university education, and the purpose of the arts that exist for civic good, that idea or that purpose is slipping away. So if we look at the idea of knowledge, of a knowledge economy, it is built on the notion that economic growth is good for everybody, right? And who can argue that? The higher education and that higher education must contribute to economic growth. So in this neoliberal context, economic growth in itself is a desirable thing, right? And it's a necessity. So if we look, for instance, at the role of higher education in the country, or in government policy making, or in general education strategies, everything is connected to the impact that education can have on economic growth. And economic growth is the aim of any national policy or strategy, strategic planning, especially now, right? So instead of saying, for instance, that everyone must have equal access to health and safety, or acceptance to live as first-class citizens, or the ability to move more fluidly between social classes, or have access to an equal social justice system, or we take better care of our environment, everything has been aligned now to the growth of the economy. It has shifted from the idea of higher education for public good and social good enfranchised or neutralized or naturalized the notion of higher education for economic good and economic growth. And it is implied as something that we should all pursue without question. So this is where the problem is, right? So this is the impact of, in fact, neoliberalism that has and we no longer, the fact that we no longer question it, right? In fact, we can no longer think about the arts, think about arts education without thinking about how it should to the job market, right? So with government-funded universities such as ours, the state control over financial and administrative decisions and enforcements are often justified, right? So, and this is especially true within the knowledge economy framework. When the government says to the university that arts education doesn't have and significant impact on the economy.
We're having a little problem with your connection.
The institution is then pushed to seeking back, or, sorry, what's that, Shamala?
Your connection is not that great. If you can move your mic.
Okay.
Okay, now it's okay.
Yeah, right. So when the government says that universities, that arts education is not directly contributing to the economy, so then the institution is then compelled to seeking or cutting back or demonstrating that graduates can meet the demands of the job market, right? Also, we mustn't forget that funding bodies like the World Bank are also aligned with this idea of the knowledge economy. So it's not difficult to see ourselves as government-funded universities that are actually transitioning into economy-centered business models followed by educational institutions overseas, globally, right? And liberal arts faculties and departments are also met with the expectation to align themselves with market-oriented curricula reforms. So unfortunately, though, with the arts, this approach doesn't seem to be very effective, even if the curriculum is revised. Why? Because if you take the performing arts, for instance, right, in spite the social and intellectual and cultural benefits of arts education, we don't live in a society that has an organized and thriving arts industry that's waiting to employ these performing arts graduates in various capacities and areas of expertise, right? So other than teaching, for instance. So the paucity of state support for the creative arts industry and the absence of a reliable vision for developing the arts industry, its infrastructure, and the arts communities makes it difficult to envision this so-called job market for which the education sector is now expected to produce a workforce. So it's almost like, it's somewhat like custom making shoes for imaginary feet, right? So we know that it's becoming increasingly difficult for arts education to survive in a neoliberal context that places capitalist metrics of value on general and higher education. And if the state invests poorly in the arts and implements reforms that disadvantage arts education, then in order to persist, what is our role in increasing a lively education and cultural system? Right, as educators, as university educators, what do we do to make the arts felt and seen and heard and being relevant and immediate? How do we encourage independence of thought and creative exploration as a process that takes place in an exchange between the liberal arts, be it philosophy, literature, fine arts, performing arts, social sciences, languages, etc., etc. How do we encourage an exchange between these disciplines, the education sector, and the community, right? So I feel that overall it is incumbent on arts faculties or academics to take action by involving themselves directly, aiming to somehow return to or retain some of the remnants of the fundamental purpose or values of higher education. That is, again, that it's a social good and a public good. So I'm going to stop there, Shamla. How are we doing for time?
Perfect, perfect. Thank you very much. Let me now introduce Professor Farah Hanifa of the University of Colombo, Department of Sociology. Over to you, Farah. Thank you, Anasuya.
Okay, thank you, Shamala. Yeah, so my perspective is coming from some literature that I've been trying to read on the issue of unemployability, and particularly Wangsa's article of 2008 and Dr. Kaushalya Fernando's recent work on the World Bank funding the university system has been acquiring now for quite a long while. I have read the Tracer study from 2015 that talks about the issue of unemployability. Now, so one of the interesting, one thing to keep in mind is that in the literature, there's a clear recognition that the issue of unemployability cannot be divorced, obviously, from the economy itself, right? The unavailability of jobs leads directly to the unemployability of graduates, much more so perhaps than any of the other things that we're talking about in terms of like the university and the kinds of skills and abilities that are being given to the students in the universities. Now, but given that, given the recognition of that issue, there is this some sort of amorphous way in which this myth of the unemployable graduate, particularly the arts graduate, persists, right? And it seems like there is a feeling that the elites that the universities were supposed to produce are not being produced in quite the same way, that there is some idea that they should be produced, okay? Now, some interesting facts that the Tracer study from 2015 state are as follows. I'll just read them out to you. One is that largest number of graduates who are unemployed are women. And some of the unemployed graduates are unemployed because they are waiting for government jobs. Then there is no difference in graduate employment between the public and private sector educational institutions. Okay, the products are equally unemployed, is the finding of this study, right? Then some of the issues of the sort of the unemployability, one of them is the attitude and expectation of the students. The student has an attitude that they expect to be treated as befits their competence and achievement, and that is seen as some sort of a failing. Then the lack of English language skills, communication skills, and problem-solving skills are also identified as inadequate, and therefore leading to the unemployability of the graduates. Now, I just want to shift to how we can understand this sort of articulation of the lack from my own experiences teaching sociology and anthropology to mostly single medium students for the past 15 years. Now, students come from really difficult backgrounds and do amazingly well given the circumstances from which they actually emerge, right? Now, but there are some very clear problems. For instance, unless they are from elite schools with some English background, their English skills are virtually non-existent, right? Now, this is a problem of the secondary school system that we are supposed to fix at the university level. And of course, there isn't even a sort of a well thought out way of fixing that problem other than through very piecemeal kinds of quick fix processes, right? Like for instance, now Kaushalya Fernando's article talks about the fact that a large amount of time is required for language acquisition, and that kind of time is never budgeted into the variety of different kinds of programs that are being introduced and have been introduced during the World Bank funded process as well to improve English language education, right? Now, the problem with this English language, lack of English language, is very particular also to our pedagogy. Now, we don't have substantial translation programs, and so the access that students have to social science reading is very minimal in the singular language, right? So our pedagogy is mostly sort of like lectures which are very content heavy, right? And we ask students to read, but we rarely or we don't have the capacity to integrate the fact that they have very minimal language skills into our programs, right? Or at least we haven't had so far. So therefore, what students do is they have these kuti, where they sort of like the English medium students the very few English medium students who are in the program, then translate the articles for students, or they pay other translators outside for really shoddy translations that they try to read. Now, some of the material that we read for social science is actually difficult for people who have English language competence, right? So you can just imagine the kind of access that students with no English competence are trying to get to this material, right? Okay. So, so another thing that we can't do is we can't really teach then. I mean, if we are providing just the content, we are not teaching students to understand how sort of arguments are constructed or how material is presented as evidence. I mean, the sort of the construction of a social science argument is not something that we can teach our undergrads to sort of like comprehend, right? Because of this particular way of teaching. Now, one other issue, in terms, again, I'm relating this to the sort of the lack that was articulated with regards to the students and their skills. The university is a very hierarchical institution, right? Now we are talking about skills like leadership and problem solving and innovation, those sorts of things. But in this very hierarchical institution, this kind of sort of like speaking up, asking questions is really not encouraged, right? I mean, we complain in our meetings and all of that about the fact that students are not engaging and all of that, but really in this very hierarchical sort of setting, that kind of intervention by the student, a questioning kind of ethos is really not encouraged. Now, when I first started, students used to ask their questions by sending in little chits to the teacher, right? I mean, they didn't want to be identified as the person asking the question even. So that culture, I mean, it's changing now. It's like different from when I first started, but I mean, there's no real sort of like encouragement of this kind of ethos of questioning and inquiry and all of that, right? So, the point that I want to make is that many of these lacks that have been identified as addressable by the university are emerging from larger structural conditions in society, right? Like, for instance, the hierarchical systems that we are all part of. I think it's not just the university, society as a whole, right? We don't question leadership, we don't question authority. So expecting those skills for the university students to actually have those skills is unrealistic if you don't understand that they come from somewhere other than the university alone, right? That is one thing. The second thing is the access to English, and the third thing is that our students are coming from a very unequal education system at the secondary level, and then they are transposed into the university, and we are supposed to deal with like a wide variety of skills that we are given with, without any acknowledging of the wide sort of like differentiation of abilities that the students are anyway coming in with, right? But so we in the sort of the second round of the World Bank funded, like I think it was the HETC grant, right? So during that time, we were compelled to deal with things like soft skills, right? And we had lots of arguments, lots of discussions about what these soft skills mean and what it actually translates into in terms of our pedagogy, right? And it was really never clear. And it is heartening to see that the current project that the World Bank is funding, as in, giving loans for, has sort of like seemed to have learned from these kinds of issues and has a different kind of emphasis, right? So the anticipated results of the AHEAD grant are threefold, and these are: one, increasing enrollment in higher education in priority disciplines for economic development. So basically STEM, science disciplines. Then improving the quality of higher education through English learning, teaching and assessment, ELTA, and English language skills enhancement. And the third one, promoting research, development, innovation, and the kicker, commercialization, right? So in a way, there's a sort of a broadening of the goals of the projects that we are supposed to carry out under the World Bank loan. But of course, in that also there are huge limitations, right?
And you have a minute. You have a minute.
Okay, huge. Yeah, got it. Huge limitations come from the fact that, as Anasuya said, that there's a very narrow definition of what the product of a university system, the student, is supposed to be. Now, the student's time at the university should be considered as a transformative experience that decides the nature of their politics and personality and how they see themselves as situated in the world, right? I mean, to be considered as employable nodes only is extremely reductive. Then in these projects, there is no education improvement conversation that includes fine arts, as Anasuya said, performing arts, the humanities, or the social sciences, priority areas for support. It is important that we speak of those sectors as necessary for a society's thriving, and furthermore, it is not without the possibility of being monetized, as Anasuya said. So what is the role of social scientists and historians, writers and artists, performers and critics in our society? How is it that there is no conversation of this sphere of actors for development in our country? Like, who has consented to such a narrow definition of development for us in the global south, right? Where we are prioritizing only STEM, where we are compelled to consume the cultural products of other contexts. And further, yeah, okay. Now, also one last point in our end, where is the conversation regarding radical innovation, right? I mean, we are in pandemic times. The world is changing. I mean, even in relation to our tourism sector, look at how we by COVID-infected Ukrainian tourists, right? I mean, there's no imagination that maybe the tourism sector itself will need to be rethought because the world has changed as a result of COVID. And we are not thinking about how we think about distance and travel and use of technology anymore, right? So this kind of innovation also is not thought about as necessary in the Sri Lankan university system. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Paya. Our last speaker is Professor Sumati Sivamohan of the University of Peradeniya. Sumati.
I'll start with two different pronouncements on progress. The first by W.E.B. Du Bois. This is what he says when he sees a school in a predominantly Black area, which is dilapidated, which is surrounded by racism and poverty. And he says, there stood progress, and progress, I understand, is necessarily ugly. The other is by my friend Azwa Hussain in his poem, 10,000 Atypical Haikus to Caliban. Progress is history's dirty joke. The higher education grapples with the idea of who. I'm going to speak theoretically or a little abstractly. Please bear with me. The modernist liberal nation state understanding of education, university education, is predicated on and grapples with the idea of who. For whom is this education? Who is this education? And who makes this education? In this, I want to underline and theorize on what I may call the continuities and discontinuities in university education, classing the years leading up to the 1990s from early independence, the nation-state liberal democratic paradigm, and the years after as the neoliberal corporatization of the state. So we don't want to romanticize what has been there, but I want to kind of talk about signal the texture of education and higher education here. Free education and university education were a phenomenal part, were a central part of the state and a part of its hegemony. At the same time, the dynamism of the early days of independence, the idea of citizenship, nation state, a progressive state, were ideals, principal objectives that spurred the movement of the country. We have these quasi-socialist democratic ideals combined with the disenfranchisement of country Tamils, the infamous Citizenship Act. The joke about Italian unification is that it did not create Italy, but it expelled Africa. And this is serious. Kannangare himself, the father of free education, initially excluded children of the upcountry Tamil community from having access to free education. And had always been a continuous process with ethnicity and class. We also see how subsequent popular struggles, 56, 71, and rising Tamil militancy later, drew upon not being proper citizens owing to class or ethnic reasons within higher education. Higher education became the territory, the site on which citizenship battles were fought, literally and metaphorically. So I have 5 points here. I will try and quickly go through those. One, the objectives, or the way I've theorized it. Education and higher education has this contradictory, but also multivalent movements built into it before the neoliberal paradigm. The person who can make sense of the world around her, the person who can be a part of the socio-political dynamics of a country, be part of productive activity, providing intellectual, bureaucratic, management, leadership, and in general be part of the labor force of economic and social production. Does education then serve to maintain prevailing status quo? It does, to a good extent. And education interpolates the individual as a subject, as a citizen into the state and the global international apparatus. So for Althusser, Gramsci and all, it's a very, what we have had all this time is also a hegemonic process. But 3, there's built into this, the idea that they can be, the education provides, gives into or produces conscious agents of change who will become a part of the critical mass. It is a democratizing act. It acts in tandem with education serving the interests of many and the masses of the people, while and at the same time enshrining the ideals of democracy and social justice in its curriculum and method. So together in a combination and in contradiction, it carves out a praxis for liberation. Then we have the 4th, which is the emerging subaltern, who is a subaltern but with some light, an opening. A further elaboration of would be that the subalternist approach, where education serves to highlight, open up spaces, and also insert the marginalized into the discourse of power, class, gender, and other forms of social relations. 5, then this is what I think for me is interesting, the individual as a subject or citizen who would be subordinate, but also be a citizen, a rebel, a patriot, and a dissenter, privileged, and an underclass. So this is, I think, is what we kind of worked with in the sense of higher education before. Now, with the myth of employability that has taken hold of, the whole country. From the president to the worker is talking of employability in various forms and is and are attacking the university education, what we see is we have given power to the powers that be. In the universities, we have allowed someone else to define it for us and shape our thinking. So this very contradictory and complex and rich movement that I had in 5 different points has been flattened out into, the people who speak and the people who can speak are the people who are powerful, and then the others are just trying to kind of scrambling for the crumbs there. In the current context, globalization, which is another name for the rapid development of capitalism as financialization, a dissolution of labor as a collective force and as a movement towards socialized citizenry and education itself is what we see. And instead, it promises at one and the same time a split, labor as drudgery and as individuated, atomistic, and consumerism also as individuated, atomistic, and in severe competition with one another. So what we see is, I mean, I don't want to repeat what Farah and Anushya has said. So I'm drawing upon all of that. So what do we have? But I'm kind of giving it a conceptual form, which we can discuss later. Employability delivers the graduate as a product, commodity, but also offers the promise of consumption. So it is not about collective thinking. It's not about it's the withering away, not of the state, but of struggle and politics. It's a withering away of the graduate as a thinking being, but the graduate as a split personality, where you have the self in angst, the undergraduate in total angst of, looking at herself as the other and seeing herself as unemployable. I mean, this is a very concrete, this is the sense I get talking to my students.
But you have 1 minute.
Okay, so I will, English then, I'll give you a little bit of a concrete example that marks this discontinuity. People say that we don't have English skills today, or we didn't pay attention to English. The English in the previous model or previous period was something that was taught, was very important with Swabhasha, with 1956. Professor Kandeya, who was one of the first instructors before he joined the academic, was one of the first instructors who said he graduated, finished his exams on a Friday, and on Monday he joined the sub-department of English at Peradeniya to teach English. But English at that time was about reading, comprehending knowledge, seeing oneself enter into a national corpus of knowledge. Today, English is divided into, this atomization. Reading, writing, listening, speaking. These are, it has become skills. So unlike some of you, I have a real problem with this idea of skills. Because skills is atomizing our knowledge production or our understanding of knowledge, and it makes us singularly unemployable. So this myth of unemployability, in a way, if I can be a bit facetious, but I'm not being facetious. In the end, you may know to listen, but you may not know to read English. I mean, that is what is actually happening. So this myth of unemployability is going to become true in a way, because if we're going to follow this understanding of unemployability, our graduate will one day become truly unemployable. In the sense of not, okay, I'll stop there. That
you're going to end with a sentence?
No, I'm using unemployable in a larger sense than in the kind of narrow neoliberal sense. You know, you will not become a person through through acquiring skills. You will not become a conscious agent of change, or even for yourself, of upliftment.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So we had three speakers speak from about this is also based on our discussion. So there is a common thread in that, but also they took a slightly different perspective. So we decided, we had originally planned on having the comments and then have Harshana do the discussant role, but we decided just now to ask him to start the discussion by drawing these three together and coming up with a sort of a common analysis so that we can use that to continue our discussion. So Harshana Ramukwala, Professor Harshana Ramukwala from the Open University is going to speak now, trying to connect all these three speakers together. Harshana, you have roughly 8 minutes.
Thank you, Shamala. Can you hear me and see me?
Yep.
Okay. So thanks a lot. I have been given a rather challenging task and I will try to do my best. Let me actually start with Sumati's reflections, and I think that's a very important set of observations she made. Historically, education, particularly arts education in Sri Lanka, has been tied to the nation state. Right, and arts education after independence was seen as important because in a way it fostered a certain sense of cultural capital, particularly within the Sinhala majority community, what in other contexts I have called authenticity. So that was the investment, but by the 1980s this turns into a market economic model, and that model, then the older model of education, no longer becomes fit for purpose. And therefore, successive governments, also advised by multilateral foreign donor agencies, etc., begin to see this system as a burden. But on the other hand, politically, it remains a very sensitive issue because large numbers of students want to enter university, so you have to somehow maintain the system as well. So this system continues in a way. I think Sumati spoke about this. And alongside this, I think she raised a very important point about the atomization of knowledge, how English language teaching particularly, I would wholeheartedly agree, that is what has happened. In a way, it has become so minutely specialized that you have lost sight of the overall objective of the discipline itself. Now, linking all of this to employability and also the pandemic moment that we inhabit now, one of the things I think in a successful education system is the ability for those who are produced by that system to face adversity and to creatively imagine ways to overcome this. But unfortunately, the discourse on employability, the current discourse on economic pandemic world model, a model where, sort of global neoliberal, the flow of neoliberal capital was ensured, etc., production chains were in place, but all of that has been disrupted, and it is unlikely that all of it will return to the pre-pandemic level stage either. So I think the frame of this is where I think this critique of unemployability needs to be located, because if you are talking about employability or unemployability in this new whatever is coming, which is very difficult for us to imagine at this moment, I think that really requires a creative and radical re-envisioning of what education is, and within that a rediscovery of the overall purpose of education. Now, one of the big buzzwords of education is this idea of transferable skills, right? That you are equipped, and a lot of the sort of the neoliberal gurus, what they say today is that a job that exists today will not exist in 5 years. So whoever you train should be this sort of very highly flexible, mobile individual, even in terms of their speak, the human capital has to be somebody who can very quickly adjust. But I don't think the kind of specialization and the kind of highly structured instruction that we are trying to push through this employable model is going to work in that element. Instead, the broader sort of liberal arts skills, if I take my own career as an instance, I didn't start out as an academic. I have had about 2 other jobs. All of that was from an English degree that I did at Peradeniya, and I did not have any other formal training. So I strongly believe that those kinds of critical skills are available in the education model we have, but due to resource constraints, etc., we are not able to broad base and mainstream those. So it's not necessarily a failure with the existing model per se, but it's other larger structural issues which the other speakers also spoke about. Because when you speak about employability, is it just the failure of the undergraduate or the graduate, or is it the failure of the economy in itself to generate sufficient employable positions? I mean, I think that has not been studied sufficiently. And also I think Farah mentioned the UGC tracer study. I think that tracer study makes very, very problematic assumptions, correlations between, for instance, English and employability. I think discounting many other variables that could be impacting the unemployability of this person. So English, I mean, there's a global literature on how English was packaged, for instance, in Africa, in third world economies as a panacea for employment, but it didn't work. Because there are other major structural issues. And also in Sri Lanka, we need to also recognize, I think at least at this moment, very honestly, that when we speak particularly in the private sector about English, we're not talking about language skills. We are talking about certain kinds of social capital, which you're never going to generate in a classroom. A student can't learn those things in a classroom. Those are things that come through your social privilege, the schools that you attend, etc. So that is, if that is the way we are framing our education discourse, I think we will never be successful. So I think it's very important that we challenge that as well. Yeah, so beyond that, I think for the discussion, I think what we really need to think about is how to combat this idea that the existing education model, particularly the arts humanities education model, is outdated. It's not fit for purpose, and it is in a way a luxury that a third world country like ours cannot afford. And it is therefore, so policymakers' arguments is, it is therefore that we need to concentrate on STEM education. So what is our response to that? Then the next question, I think, with the pandemic and the exacerbation of pre-existing social inequalities, how will education address these? So are we then going to base our education system on a model of development that is now being radically questioned by the pandemic as being incapable of delivering justice, economic, social, or cultural justice to many people in the world? Are we still basing our education system on that, or do we re-envision that radically in this context? And in a way, this has opened a space for that kind of radical questioning, and I don't know whether if we are using that space sufficiently. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Harshana. So as I mentioned, we wanted to really have time for discussion. So the discussion, we are open to a discussion. I want to say that we consider ourselves trying to understand this issue. So we are interested in furthering a dialogue, but also we are trying to learn through this process of having these kinds of online discussions. So I would like to invite Siri Hettige to speak. If we can speak briefly, and would you like to speak, Professor Hettige? Professor Hettige?
Yeah, I'm coming, yeah. Okay. Well, it's a very interesting discussion, and I think the stage was set by the previous speakers. I'm not going to take too much time, but I want to basically put, a few questions for you to consider. I mean, like we are within the university system, trying to deal with problems that go beyond the university system. Not only the public education system, highly inequitable public education system. I mean, a lot of the issues that we are talking about, are transferred from the public education system to the university system. That's now, so how to really address that issue. The second is, we should not talk as if, we have a perfect university system, and that within that, our problems are not really, emanating from within, but from without. Now, that's again is not true, because we have huge problems within the university system itself. I mean, like we had only 5 universities, and I remember going to the National Education Commission when they wanted to expand, the universities to the provinces. I'm not against expanding opportunities, but the point is that at a time when, the most of the, well-established of academics had already left the country, when many departments didn't have a single senior academic, we wanted to actually, have more and more universities. And then, of course, you can see after 30 years, what has happened to the entire university system. Of course, we have certain, pockets of excellence, but, as an entire system, we have serious issues, okay? I'm not only talking about, the financing, because we have one of the lowest investments in education in the whole of Asia. I mean, even in South Asia. So the point is that with very limited, public finances available for the entire education system, and of course the universities are the same. So I think that's this issue. The second, and then last point that I want to touch on is this whole employability issue. I think the main problem is that, everything is reduced to economism. I mean, that was touched on by quite a few people. The point is that, economy is not the only thing. We need to also, look at, other issues that we have to deal with. And I think there we are talking about, let's say we are talking about the social system itself. I mean, it's a big issue in Sri Lanka. And then, of course, I mean, I don't have to mention this massive environmental calamity that is unfolding. I mean, one cannot ignore that also. And then, of course, the whole culture issue. I mean, the huge cultural problems that we are grappling with, for the last 70 years. So the point is that we have to see, I mean, as academics, we can bring these things together. But in practical terms, it is academic, because in the real world, people basically do not really bring these things together, and they don't see the connections. I'm talking about highest policy level. There's no discussion. So what I'm getting at is that there's a huge disconnect between this kind of very enlightened academic discourse on a very important issue on the one hand, and the kind of discussions that are happening at highest levels of policy making. Look at the National Education Commission. I mean, it has been there for so long. And the point is, what is the role of the National Education Commission, and so on and so forth. So I think there are huge, and I think, I don't think that we can resolve all these issues within an hour or two. But the point is that I'm really glad that, these young people like you have really taken up this very important issue. And I think we are really challenged. And one final point, one final remark, the transition that we are talking about. Certainly, pre-COVID situation, is not going to be, really preserved, lock, stock and barrel post-COVID. That is obvious, because, the whole global economy is in shambles. I mean, already. So the point is that there has to be a, we have to revisit a lot of the things that we are talking about, including the economy itself. So the point is that, that transition will have to be, looked at more carefully, and how we could really, imagine this post-COVID scenario as a country, and of course, not in isolation of the rest of the world.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'm sorry that I took too much of your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Hettige. I will invite others also to comment before I ask the panelists to do so. Dr. Dhammika Herath? Dhammika? Are you there?
Actually, I'm not
okay.
Dr. Dhammika. I'm Dhammika. Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Dhammika from KCG. Yes.
Okay.
What I was thinking, most of the education output we had today is not geared to get the employment, but they have some other expectations. So what I was personally suffering for last couple of years to get our graduates, undergraduates to for kind of research work, they are highly reserved with the high expectations, and their expectations are very high at that moment. But for me, what I was thinking right now is we should have some kind of scale for the graduates, undergraduates, maybe A-level qualified, and the postgraduates, some rates. Very recently, I have joined with some forum in India. So they have a fixed rate. So like 1,500 rupees, Indian rupees for the graduate per day. So then everybody knows their highest expected salary or the remuneration for the given task. So now the situation in Sri Lanka, it is highly, I don't know what happened. It is very, like distorted for some reason. Expectations are very high, and you have an opportunity, but also, we also can't quote for high grades because our, inputs are going to very expensive. Then we can't compete with the world market. So there is some issue is going on, but still we are talking about unemployment and adaptability issues. And very recently, I just put in the message, I saw some 2 pilots put into the driver's kit, and they adapted to the COVID situation. So I don't think that our graduates are never willing to do that. So that is all my point, and I don't know in theoretically how we can explain, because I'm kind of economic graduate, and then I was actually I was practically suffering from this thing, because I was every day basis I am advertising graduates to join with the research work, but no one is willing to come and do a part-time work. They were looking for at least 1 year or 2 year contract. So I mean, if we can adapt for a short period, that is the main thing. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Ramila Yusuf? Ramila?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. You had said something.
No, it was sort of something that I was thinking about. I mean, this was also a conversation that I had when we were graduate students in the US, where also it was increasingly sort of women becoming visible in psychology, and what was happening to sort of investments in the discipline of psychology, because the face of psychology was changing. And so I was wondering whether that was sort of an appropriate way of thinking about some of the problems that we were encountering in sort of our faculties, because our faculties are increasingly female, right? So I think at this point, the art faculty at Peradeniya, we get probably out of about 1,000 students, we probably get about 20 male students, and that also I think includes Buddhist priests. So if you look at the face of the arts faculties, they're very female. And then you also sort of think about what this means for, how policymakers think of investments, right? And I have heard over and over again in these sort of World Bank circles where they talk about, we are putting in so much money, and the labor force participation is something like 34%, right? And it's so it's talked about, you know, we are giving, we are investing
For
money.
women, you're talking about women. Okay.
Yeah, so the female labor participation is about 30-something%. And it has been decreasing, I think, from the 90s, where it was in the 45% range. And so, so in the World Bank circles, you hear this talk about, you know, we are investing, but we are not getting a return on investment. So, you know, that sort of this market economy sort of thing. And then also you think about attitudes towards women in general. So recently I was watching parliamentary proceedings, and there was this contention about these Ukrainian tourists. And when the concerns of, I think, the female chairperson of the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority were brought up, the way the government ministers reacted to it was to say that the person who was bringing up the concerns and this particular chairperson were having some sort of, inappropriate relationship. And so if that is sort of the attitude of lawmakers towards women, and then you have these disciplines which are increasingly female, I'm just wondering whether there is some connection between whether at the policymaker level they want to invest in women, whether they see that as a priority. And I think our parliament has been really problematic in many, many ways. And then also the question about how does this sort of gel with what the World Bank is thinking, you know?
Okay.
And so that was the concern I was bringing up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jude Fernando, Dr. Jude Fernando, you had a long comment. Jude, are you? Is Jude here? On, he's gone. Maybe Priyan?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a long comment, but basically, so I agree with all the speakers, what I heard
Please
about
be a
this.
little brief.
So I just posted it. So
yeah,
so
go ahead,
basically
though.
the point is that I agree with the speakers, what they were saying about education and social reproduction, right? But then the question is that how can we start change from bottom up, from the classroom settings, right? I mean, given the fact that the bringing systemic changes takes time, right? So I think I also agree with speakers, you know, the idea that there's a distinction, there's the employable and the unemployable education are two different things. I think it's a distinction is false. And also I think that this distinction some people make between the
What's the
skills
distinction?
required.
What's the distinction?
Distinction that people make between the skills required by the marketplace and the skills provided by an ideal type of university education. I'm talking about the well-rounded critical thinker, right? I think these distinctions are based on problematic assumptions. They make sense only in relation to the economic, the neoliberal growth paradigm, right? Sometimes we continue our discussions taking these distinctions for granted, right? Employable versus unemployable. I think what we really need to do is to think about how can we articulate the relationship between knowledge production and the economy outside the context of this neoliberal growth paradigm. And there are certain tools now. One of the most important tools that people are using is a degrowth perspective, degrowth economic perspective, right? I think, again, another thing that we can think about doing is, I know some of you are doing it, how can we shift the classroom and exam-based kind of pedagogy to a more field and research-based pedagogy, starting from the undergraduate level, right? So, and also how can we sort of democratize the knowledge production in our classroom settings? I think there are a lot to learn from, so perhaps we could start a dialogue on critical, how can we use the tools of critical pedagogy as it applies Sri Lankan context, right?
Okay.
How can we use those tools in our curriculum design and classroom settings, and how do you organize the physical classroom structure, et cetera, right? I think there are a lot to learn. There are so many people around the world are now applying these critical pedagogy tools. And I mentioned a few names in my comment, like Paulo Freire, Rip Gibson, Angela Davis, Henry Giroux, Peter McLaren, and people like that, right? I think bringing this critical pedagogy perspective into our classroom settings might be a way to bring change from bottom up. And I think I personally think the semester system was a disaster, right? Is a disaster. I think it was a system that was introduced by the World Bank, to transform the education system for the service of the marketplace. I think for me, I find that having taught in the semester system for more than 10 years, I think that's not a good system.
Thank you very much, Jude. And I also agree. I think we also have to think about it in terms of not just the social sciences, but every discipline outside the social sciences as well. Professor Priyan Dias?
Yes. Okay, I have put some things on the.
Yeah, can you be brief?
Yeah. I have put some things in the chat, right? Somebody's doing some work. You better ask somebody else. Are you hearing a noise? Are you hearing a noise?
Yeah, but we can hear you. You can.
Okay, right. Okay. So, but the thing is, people can read what I wrote in the chat. But one of the things that we have to say is, I don't think we should, take on both the idea of, creating employable graduates, but we must be sure that we are producing graduates who are well formed according to our own standards, right? So, for example, now Fazana, I think, said that, either because of lack of English skills of the students or lack of adequate translation of materials, students are unable to frame arguments and know how to use evidence. So that is a big failure in our education system, right? So I think we should make sure, at least from our point of view, that we are producing people either with engineering mindsets or scientific mindsets, or this kind of liberal thinking mindsets. If we are not producing liberal thinkers, I think we have to take that responsibility on ourselves. Let's forget the employability thing. Let's make sure we are doing what we promised to do. This is what I want to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Priyan. Can I ask Kaushalya, do you want to speak? Kaushalya Pereira?
No.
Okay. Andy?
Okay, thanks, Shamla. I think my question was kind of coming from a more historical perspective, because I've been looking at like the early debates around the setting up of the university. And I was wondering why it is that, like, this has become so urgent now. And when you look historically, I think, and G.C. Mendis makes this point in relation to the free education reforms, where he points out that actually vernacular education has been free for a long time. Right, but it was, and in making education free, it was really benefiting the upper and middle classes, right? And so I think part of the reason for us to be talking about employability now is that for a long time, employment was not a problem because of who university education benefited, right? Whereas now I think it's changing, right? And so now as these things are changing, we have to, these questions are becoming more urgent. So I think for me, it means asking the question, what then is the role that universities play, or in assumptions or aspirations for social mobility, right? And then out of that then comes the question as to whether the university itself needs to be decentered, right? As this kind of place that, is the assumptions I feel about what aspirations come out of university education. Because for the longest time, I mean, arts graduates just went into the civil service without a problem, right? But now that's no longer the case, right? And I think it's out of those kind of structural changes that have occurred in the economy, in society, that these questions are becoming prominent. So that's why I'm just wondering, out of that, the question arises, how do we decenter the university itself in these conversations? Thank you.
Shamala, could I make an intervention? I mean, I think the questions are, on the comments are so varied. Could we have some kind of response?
Can we have let's just finish. There's 2 more questions.
All right, okay.
And then after that, I will give you our time, because otherwise we are going to miss out. Ahilan, do you want to speak? 2 comments.
Yeah.
Yes, go on.
No, I guess guys, I want to kind of see this as both a longer term issue that the universities have to grapple with, what education means, what is the relationship between university education and not just employment, but democratization, our role in the larger social system. But also at the current moment, there is a very clear focused attack using this employment argument, right? In a time when there is increasing levels of unemployment. Those who have been employed have been thrown out of jobs. But the government, the regime is using this argument of employability to deflect and to kind of cover up for the flawed economic policies that they're taking forward, which are neoliberal to some extent, continue to be a focus on export-oriented, some of the sectors. So without taking responsibility for that and to change the policies that would generate employment, the attack is on education. So I guess the quick thing I want to say is, shouldn't the university community take on that attack head on and point to the kind of, you know, the kind of pernicious way in which this argument is being used and covering up for the kind of the flawed policies that the government and the regime are taking. So that's a short-term thing. There's a longer-term problem. So I think maybe if we can distinguish the two and work, it might be easier. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ahilan. I'm just going to limit it to the next two comments, and then we'll go back on to discussion. Sanjeeva, do you want to speak? Sanjeeva.
Yeah, I'll make a short. I just, the unemployment rate in Sri Lanka right now is about 4.2%, which by any global standard is very low. So I'm not sure what the argument is, saying that there is a major unemployment problem. And the 2020 numbers because of COVID, I don't think have come out. So I don't know what that obviously is going to be higher. To me, there is a practical reality of the production of graduates who come out as unemployable because those people haven't been able to find jobs. And some of that is mindset, some of that is English, some of that is all kinds of problems. But those numbers are still very small. We have 50,000 people and so forth in those numbers, whereas the total employed population is far, far larger. So I don't think this is an attack on the universities or something like that. It is more about the unemployment rates in Sri Lanka are still very low, but the number of people who get into university, and those majority of them are coming out, majority, I don't know what the percentages are. Some percentages are coming out and unable to find gainful jobs. And there is a problem that needs to be addressed.
Sanjeeva, that was one of the reasons for this whole discussion today was based on the budget speech as well as the president's speech, in which this issue of unemployability and the lack of the legacy of universities in creating unemployed graduates was specifically mentioned. And that was what we are responding to in this session. So we agree with you, at least I agree with you, that maybe the issue is more complicated than the way the government speaks of it. My last invitation is to Kaushalya Herath. If you can make a brief comment, and then we'll go back to the speakers.
I think, Shamala, we can move to the discussion. I just shared my perspective, and it's in the chat section. So we'll move to the...
Okay, thank you. Sumati, Farah, and Anasuya, the comments are on the chat. If you want, I've also noted them down. So I was wondering if you can, shall I just give you the space to respond to the comments as they were, because I think they were comments and were meant as a general discussion. So maybe you can approach it more together rather than specific comments, or if you want to address specific comments, you may as well. Shall we start with Anasuya? Anasuya, are you here?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, Shamala.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I agree with most of the comments. I know there are various perspectives, and also it's kind of difficult now to respond to each of them. But perspective-wise, yes, there are different various views, and I think there was a question about gender and the arts. And I do agree that there is, say, for instance, with the performing arts, and also there was another question which I would actually, I'd like to answer that, as to how we get back into making, in a post-COVID situation, how we deal with this issue now, getting back into and I feel that with the arts, and this is something that I've been working on for some time now, that we need to connect as universities and mainly as arts-based universities and as a department where I work, drama and theatre. We have tried to invest some of our work in the community. So what we're trying to actually do is get back into the community where we work, where the students and the academics then work with these small pockets of in the community. Now we are just still drawing our plans for this, and we need to figure out, there will be negotiations that will have to be made as to where we step back and let the community then move forward with whatever arts projects or the type of work that we do with them. But the students then have the opportunity to interact one-on-one instead of remaining in classrooms or in studios. So the evaluations that take place in classrooms or the learning process will then be taken into the community in applied performance projects or work where they initiate performance projects by including the community and recognizing their problems, issues, and identifying, the real problems that they would have to then deal with when they go out back into the community and work with as artists or as teachers, for instance. So even as teachers, then we need to, when we produce most of the art students, performing arts students, go out into the secondary or primary education sectors, and what we need to now focus is on the kind of teacher or educator that we create in a university, and the mindset or how they can go out back into the community and become influencers and actually initiate changes in policies, and understand on ground level, on community level, what they can contribute, and then take away from them, but become communicators then between the universities and the policymakers and the community. So even teachers have that role in, so these are just ideas that we are grappling with at the moment in the department, within the faculties, and especially where the arts are concerned, because we are a performing arts university. We feel this pressure more for some reason because, and especially again with the COVID situation, as to how we teach the performing arts, especially theatre, dance, and so on and so forth. So, we've had to then rethink the way we understand performance pedagogy, performing arts education, and how we then transfer it among, and how we communicate then between the student and the academics, and also between the university, the policymakers, and then also mainly between us and the community, because I feel we are far, dislodged from the realities of the community when we get into a university, as it is a hierarchy, and it is, we are all a little up there, and we need to get back into that ground level, because especially in the arts is where we are most effective.
Thank you, Anasuya. So your point is that we need to rethink education, disconnect the different groups that are involved, and that is kind of a way forward for particularly the arts and the issue of, I think, women and the gender nature of this discourse. Farah?
Sorry, thanks, Shamala. So I just wanted to make a few brief comments that would amplify some of the comments in the thread by, well, Sumadi's speech, and Harshana's speech, and Professor Priyandayas's comment. So in this sense, now, first of all, I think it is very important that we understand that there are huge problems within the university system that need to be addressed. So it's not about denying that there are issues that need addressing, but about the sort of the narrow ambit through which these issues are being addressed. That is the issue, right? That is the problem. And also in terms of employability itself, it's not that we don't want our students to be employable or that we are not responsible for them being employable, but that this, what is termed employability and what is required for that particular kind of employability is defined very narrowly and very damagingly. And that is what we want to move away from. So having said that, in terms of the English issue, what I wanted to amplify what Sumati was saying also, that the idea of English as a skill is limiting, for instance, the ability to communicate in the English language for sort of purposes within a workplace or whatever, versus the fact that, for pedagogical purposes, we feel really constrained by the lack of people's English skills, right? I mean, that is, for, the ability to understand how arguments are constructed, for instance, and all of that, that we were taught in English using certain kinds of texts, we can't do for our students, right? Because of the lack of language capacity. So that is what I wanted to sort of emphasize. Then, so responding to Professor Priyanda's, I mean, that was the point, that there are certain problems in the university system that we need to address, and I don't know whether the current frameworks through which they are being addressed are actually solving our problems or creating new ones. Thanks.
Thanks, Farah. Sumati?
Okay, I will go back. I find this parallel conversation on chat very disconcerting, and Ansuya was saying very interesting stuff, and then Farah, but then, so I think sometimes it doesn't really work, you get distracted. I just want to say that...
Sumati, can you stick to 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, all that I want to say is that there is the universities are not being supported by the state. So if what Priyan Dayas, to address what Priyan Dayas said, that we should, improve the quality of this thing, that is not being done by the government. Instead, what they're doing is, you are wrong, your student is wrong. So there is a real problem. There is a very material problem here. They are not investing in the universities. And there are one thing, maybe they are unable to because of economic constraints. But instead of admitting to that, they're saying the problem is you. What I'm saying again and again to people who are not in the know, like Dhammika, Herath, and Sanjeev and all that, what the corporate sector and what the government and the UGC are trying to tell us to do is to disempower everybody, including the businesses. I don't care about whether you do well. I wish you would not do very well, but even looking, I'm not interested in the businesses doing well here. I think they should pay, if they employ, they should pay a decent salary. But even from your perspective, this employability discourse is not helpful to anybody, because it doesn't. So don't say we want to employable and you are wrong. Don't say that, because it is what the employability discourse does is destroy education, period. Any knowledge of English. Nobody learns English the way the World Bank is trying to tell us to teach English. You are a full person. That's how you learn English. And that's what we are trying to tell everybody, that the current discourse is not helpful to anybody. We have to rethink and move forward in a very different way. And to do that, I would like to keep, personally, the corporate sector out of it for the time being. Because okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sumati. Thank you, Farah. Thank you, Anasuya. And thank you to all those who engaged in this discussion. A lot of very important and meaningful questions and concerns were brought up. And we want to continue this discussion in the future because, and that's what we've been doing. We've not been considering any of these discussions as one-off events, but using them to propel ourselves to other discussions. So for example, right now we're trying to talk about this issue of the problems of the pandemic and the lack of sensitivity by talking with other groups and maybe developing another platform like this where we can talk about the problems that teacher unions and student unions and students and other community-based groups are dealing with right now, because we feel that the current sort of way of dealing with the pandemic is kind of like using a hammer to address every single problem that there is, rather than figuring out having a more gentle way of handling the problems that people have, gentle and multifaceted, and sort of a way of that is enriching to everybody. So we will continue these discussions, and we hope that you will get involved and participate, because ultimately we hope that this will change how the discussion on education goes forward among policy makers as well. Please, as Professor Hettige said, somehow there's a disconnect there as well. So with that, thank you again, and we hope to see you again in our other public events. Thanks, bye. And I thank all three speakers again. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.